idea that the Europeans can simply fill the shoes of the Americans, replace the intelligence, the logistics, the weapons, the planning. It does sound like fantasy land. It's not going to happen. And it does appear something has changed in media over the past 2 weeks or so, in which the Europeans start to recognize that they don't really have the money, they don't have the industrial capacity, there's no political will, there's a lack of solidarity. But with this in mind, do you expect the Europeans to start to fall in line because they have opposed Washington very strongly? I would say, they seem like they want to sabotage Trump's peace efforts. They still don't want to give up on any sanctions. They don't want to see the war end on any unfavorable terms, which means no NATO, territorial concessions, no security guarantees. Again, the foundation which America has agreed to.
Well, there's another critical event that very few people ever talk about, but one that's going to have a profound impact, and that is massive economic recession inside the United States. We are very definitely headed into a recession. Now, you'll have some people argue and say, oh, no, that's not really true. And of course, no one in the Trump administration wants to stand up and announce that. The sad truth of the matter is President Trump had nothing to do with the onset of this recession. It's not his, but he's going to be stuck with it. In other words, he's going to have to deal with it. That recession could be deep, deep in the sense that it could border on depression. What we do right now, or what the Trump administration does, particularly regarding tariffs and spending in general, will have an impact on that recession. So I think by June, our government is going to have to make some tough decisions. Now, we all know Congress, the Senate, the House, they will not make any decisions of any value because they're incapable of taking hard decisions and making hard choices. That puts them at risk. They can't get reelected and so forth and so on. The president is different. The president is going to have to step forward, assert his authority, and make some profound changes in terms of spending and adjusting our interaction in the economic sphere with other countries in ways that he may or may not like. But what we do is going to have an impact on that recession. Now, in Europe, my impression is it's far more serious. I talked yesterday to Martin Armstrong. He's not the only economic analyst that I've talked to lately, but he suggested that it was almost a coin toss right now. Who is in the worst condition, most likely to default, if you will, London or Paris? I voted for London. I think they're on the skids and they're likely to go under first. All you have to do is look at the bond markets, what they call, of course, gilts. And if you cannot finance your government, if no one will buy your debt, you're out. We are very nearly there now. Japan faces something similar, but France and Britain in particular have an acute problem. So the notion of spending hundreds of billions of euros that you don't have, that you're not going to be able to create, and then finance a major military campaign against the Russian state at this stage is absurd. So the British population, by some estimates, is very close to civil war, particularly in England. I don't know. I'm not there. I can't evaluate it. And I know in France, the revolutionary fervor is sort of just beneath the surface. The proverbial pot is coming to a slow boil. I don't know that Macron and Starmer and even Merz at this point are going to be there much longer. Merz may last longer than the others, but I think the whole idea right now of going into Ukraine and opposing Russia is just fanciful nonsense. By the way, I think Mr. Putin understands that, which is one of the reasons people ask all the time, why hasn't President Putin moved more decisively? Well, I think he's exercising patience. I mean, if he waits long enough, these economies in Western Europe are going to tank anyway, and those governments will fall. The whole globalist leadership caste is in danger right now of going under, which I think is a very good thing. Very good for Europe, very good for us. But at the same time, that's going to be tough days ahead for the French, for the Germans, for the British, for many people.
I was curious, what what do you see in the future of Europe now? Because it's I saw also Merz giving that is the, yeah, incoming German chancellor who was making a speech in the Bundestag. He was arguing that, this is not just a war against Ukraine. Russia is at war with our country, with Germany. He has gone to war with Europe. We have to spend hundreds of billions to fight the Russians. I mean, to hear the German leaders speak in this manner, it's quite. Yeah, frightening to see it going down this path again. And I spoke to a member of the EU Parliament, the German one, and he had like over the 3 decades experience as a diplomat in the UN, and he had many good points. He was making the argument that well, first of all, they don't have the money for this, but also if they arm themselves, it's gonna not just alienate a lot of the other Europeans who might not have the best historical memories of a militarized Germany. They're gonna have, of course, a possible war with Russia. They're gonna alienate the Americans. I mean, the whole thing just seemed, yeah, very careless and emotional. But 3 years ago, when the Russians invaded, we were told that, well, now NATO will be stronger than ever. We have our enemy back. Solidarity will come. Uh, Finally, there's a purpose for NATO. But of course, it's not playing out as such. What do you think? There's a possibility that NATO might fall apart, and what would be this of so? What would be the main driving forces or supporting that hypothesis?
Well, in January of 2022, I was interviewed by Dimitri Simes at the National Interest in Washington, D.C. And you can look it up and you'll find it, I'm sure, archived somewhere. And I was part of two or three other people. And they said, what do you think is going to happen? I said, the Russians will very definitely invade. And everybody else took the position of, well, that's very risky. And the Russians don't want to put themselves at risk or their economy and face even more sanctions if they do that. I said, well, this is an existential question for Russia. They will definitely go into Ukraine. And then I said, I doubted very seriously that if NATO committed to an operation against Russia in Ukraine, which we did, that it would survive the war. I said, I think by the time this finally ends, so will NATO. Look, Glenn, NATO has had no rational objective, let alone raison d'etre, for a very long time. To be frank, I was in Europe in 1992, shortly before I took command back in the United States, and we'd come back from the desert. We looked at what was happening in Yugoslavia. We knew that the Russians were in poor shape at that point. And we all said, well, the best thing we can do right now, given the international conditions, is to leave. If we Americans leave now, Europeans will have a breathing space before new actors consolidate, new nations consolidate, new alliances spring up, and they can chart their own course into the future. Well, that didn't happen, obviously, but I thought we should have gotten out of there in 92, 93, and 94, period. You can leave a tiny contingent there, but the way we're organized right now, how deeply we're dug in with our headquarters and our command and control, we should have gotten that out. And then you might see a different picture today in Europe. But NATO, much like the European Union, is an unrealistic construct. Because if you go back through European history, look at the last 500, 600, 700 years, whatever you want to do, the view from Berlin is very different from the view in Paris. The view of the world in Rome is not the same as the view of the world in Stockholm. In other words, how you see the world in Europe as a European depends very much on where you live. That shouldn't be a big surprise to anybody. But the idea that all Europeans come together harmoniously and say, we will unite forever to defend ourselves against anybody who challenges us, simply not realistic. You could never get Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, and French excited about fighting wars somewhere in the Balkans or Central Asia or the Middle East or somewhere else. Some would, but for the most part, people didn't want to do that. And you'll remember that battle cry, NATO is either out of area or out of business. And I agreed. I said they should be out of business because there's no reason for the Europeans to sort of reconstitute their colonial empires. There's no reason for people to march into Africa, the Middle East, or elsewhere. Well, obviously, I lost that debate, and I had to go through and watch what happened in the Balkans. I was there in 95. I was involved in it in 95, 96. I went back at the end of 97 and was involved until 2000 in Kosovo. And remember, I had served previously for many years in Germany. So I've operated within this NATO framework for a long time. And it just doesn't make sense for reasons of culture, national interest. I think the same fate is likely to befall the EU. The EU may fragment first, and I don't see how the euro survives. I was sitting in Vienna when the euro was announced, and everybody was saying, "Oh, this is wonderful. This is uniting Europe, and everybody's going to use the same currency." And I said, "But the bankers in the Netherlands and Germany do not do business the way the bankers in Italy and Spain and France do." In other words, there are different views of how you use monetary policy from nation to nation. And this is going to create more friction and more mutual suspicion than it will create unity. And of course, all you have to do now is go to any number of European countries, and everything that's wrong is the fault of those damn Germans. They're the problem because they run everything in the EU. They're the ones, they stand behind the euro and so forth, so on. Well, that's nonsense. I mean, everybody has some portion of the blame, but most of us, and that's true here in the United States, we are the authors of our own problems. It's not the creation of some foreigner somewhere. But I think the Germans have been picked up and used as a useful and convincing whipping boy. And of course, the Germans have bent over backwards and said, "Beat me to death if you like. I'm ready to take it. After all, I'm a German." Well, all of that has to change, and I think it will change. I see that happening right now beneath the surface. So I would regard Merz and Macron and Starmer and many others as a sort of final performance of the globalist ruling class. They're all going to be swept away. We just have to be patient. We're facing something similar here, and this globalism has not worked. And that doesn't mean that the world is going to collapse and we're all going to go to war with each other. Doesn't mean that at all. But we're going to have to go back to a planet of sovereign states inside regions, and various regions will coalesce. I mean, I can imagine Scandinavia, certainly Finns, Swedes, Danes, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Germans, coalescing into some sort of Northeast European security zone. I could see an alliance emerging there. I could see a different kind of alliance down in the Mediterranean and a different alliance up in Northwest Europe, where I think in most cases the Norwegians would prefer to be allied with the British, the United States, and Canada. That's fine. I just think these things will happen. And I don't see them as frightening. I see them as natural consequences of development over many, many years. The old world order is gone. This thing we called the post-war liberal international order, which was always nonsense. It just meant the world that we shaped as Americans, that's over. We're going into new territory, and that's all right. I think things will come out quite well. I don't see this as the beginning of Armageddon at all. In fact, the good news is I think more and more Europeans are figuring out that there is absolutely nothing to be gained by going to war with anyone in Europe.
Yeah, especially the largest country. No, I agree that well, as the world becomes more multipolar, I do think that the US and the Europeans will have more divergent interest, which is why you see some split. But this idea also in Europe that we can simply fill the Americans' shoes, even when we talk about Europe suggesting this one entity. I mean, even now the Italians suggested that, the most important partner they have is the United States. So they're not going to follow some Brussels bureaucrats who suggest that they should, split or go against the Americans. So it does beg the question to what extent, as you said, all these interests are actually aligned. What is this European we're speaking of? Indeed, many people also now point to the fact that the EU seems more and more militant, but that's because we have an Estonian as a foreign foreign policy chief, that is Kaja Kallas, and even Politico now has been pointing out that many of the European countries are getting a bit fed up because she's going beyond what's will argue to be the agreed language. She's pretty much declaring war on the Russians, so it's quite quite extreme. So I think the
Well, you know,
assumption.
in the last century, there was a memorandum prepared by Prince Gorshakov, and I think it was prepared for Alexander the Second. It could have been Alexander the Third, the Tsar. I can't recall which one. And in this particular memorandum, which then was subsequently sent to Vienna and Berlin, there was a statement in there about the concert of Europe. And Bismarck took out his pen, circled concert of Europe, drew an arrow, and then in the margins wrote, "What is the concert of Europe?" question, and sent that in to the Kaiser. And that was Kaiser Wilhelm I at the time. And they all agreed, what are we talking about? What concert of Europe? But that was a different world where people came to terms with reality. It's like, the Russians expressed a desire to take Constantinople. In other words, go in and liberate it from the Turks in 1879. And the German attitude was, well, what particular difference does it make to us who controls the Bosporus? It doesn't. But it turned out that it made a great deal of difference to the British. And the British threatened to go to war against Tsarist Russia if they replaced the Turks in Constantinople with Russians. Well, look at the map, look at the various peoples in Europe, and tell me how much has changed.